Hello and welcome to The World This Week. I'm Jonathan Steele. In the first half of today's programme, we're returning to Egypt and addressing murmurs that the country may be heading towards a constitutional crisis. And is democracy in Greece under threat from the far right? That's in part two. Now, it's been 3 months since demonstrators took to the streets in Egypt protesting President Morsi's sweeping powers. They're still there, calling for Morsi to leave, and now it looks like Egyptians will have to wait even longer for their parliamentary election too. Charlotte Hawkins has more.
Egypt's parliamentary election could be delayed because of objections from the Constitutional Court. The court has sent 5 amendments to the parliamentary election law back to the Shura Council, Egypt's upper house of parliament. The court challenged the constitutionality of several articles, including one gender-related article which violates the principle of equality.
ليس هناك وسيلة إلا الالتزام بما قالت به المحكمة الدستورية العليا، ولكن ليست هذه التعديلات ولا ما ارتأته المحكمة الدستورية العليا هي الكفيل بحل الأزمة السياسية المستحكمة في مصر. الأزمة أعمق من ذلك.
President Mohamed Morsi had been expected to announce the beginning of the electoral period early next week, and polling day was due in April. However, a source in Morsi's office now says that the court's intervention could set polling day back by weeks or even months. The National Egyptian Movement and the Revolutionary Forces announced this week that they would boycott the election. At the same time, splits in the parliament have been becoming more apparent, as Morsi sacked one Salafist Al-Noor party member and another resigned. The delay to the election could provoke a constitutional crisis, as the newly approved constitution stated that elections should run within 60 days, which would be tomorrow. The postponing of the election will do little to placate protesters, who have been demonstrating for weeks and calling for President Morsi to step down. Charlotte Hawkins, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me in the studio today to discuss the effects of this delay to the electoral process are Oliver McTernan, Director of the think tank Forward Thinking, and Dr. Wafik Moustafa of the Conservative Arab Network here in Britain, but himself an Egyptian. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Dr. Moustafa. Do you think that this election delay helps or harms President Morsi?
I think it certainly does harm President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood project.
In the sense that they want to show that they can get ahead with democracy and that they're not themselves an obstacle? Is that what you mean?
I think it's a lot of things happening at the same time. The most important is the chaos in the streets. The economy is crumbling. The security in the street, people not feeling safe. And people cannot find jobs. The trust between the president or the authority of the president have been greatly undermined. And I think he is in great trouble.
Well, Oliver McTernan, you've worked a lot with different Egyptian political parties, and I believe you're going there very shortly to have another session with them. I mean, do you think that people are really pressing very hard for this parliamentary election? Are some of them perhaps not even ready to run again at this stage so early?
Well, I think this postponement because of the Constitutional Court is regrettable, because the reason Morsi took the sweeping powers a few months ago was precisely to stop the Constitutional Court ruling the assembly that drew up the new constitution as illegal and therefore dissolving it. So he took these powers to rush through elections because they felt this was the proper way to go forward through the ballot box. Now we see, and I agree, that he is going to lose again on the street because people will see, they won't understand that this is a natural process. In some ways, it's good that the Constitutional Court is looking at laws, because if you had elections and then this issue came up and you had the Parliament dissolved again through the Constitutional Court, I think we'd have a worse crisis. So, you know, these are the inevitable growing pains, you might say, of a transition to democracy.
No, but the Constitutional Court is, in a way, a critic of Morsi. I mean, they've had confrontations with Morsi, the very fact that they dissolved the Parliamentary Assembly. Some people say it in some way represents people from the old Mubarak regime. Is that fair enough?
Well, I think there was, beyond the Brotherhood and the Islamic parties, even in the secular parties that were for reform, there was an awareness that the Constitutional Court was serving old interests, you know, that they were appointees of the old regime. And so the way they interpreted the law or tried to impose an interpretation of the law, in fact, was to hinder the progress that people were looking for. The day before Morsi took these sweeping powers, I was in the Shura Council, and we had a gathering of different parties, mainly secular, and they were all predicting that something would have to be done to stop a judicial coup. So there's always been that suspicion, well beyond the Brotherhood, but among all the reforming parties, that the Constitutional Court would be a tool of the old regime.
Now, some of these parties have announced that they're going to boycott elections whenever the elections take place. I mean, do you think that's a good idea? I mean, shouldn't they, now that they've got a real chance to free elections for the first time, shouldn't they take part?
I think the main problem here, Morsi have rushed the constitution, as we know, in the 11th hour. They stayed about 18 hours continuous work and rushed the constitution. One thing. In another aspect, he more or less introducing Islamization by stealth in the country. So I think there's a lot of worries about it. About judiciary, I like to say something. During Mubarak, they are reasonably independent because Ayman al-Zawahiri, Omar, the blind cleric in America, Omar Abdurrahman, were acquitted by the Egyptian judiciary during Mubarak. So they've done few things against the regime, Mubarak's regime, which is in the past. So I think they're quite independent, although the Islamists trying to, anybody oppose them to say they are Mubarak's men.
But if there are going to be elections, and now the Constitutional Court is trying to change the electoral law to make it more democratic, surely parties should take part and not boycott. I mean, isn't that almost an admission that they know they wouldn't get very many seats?
I think probably that's one part of it. On the other side, probably just don't want to play the game on the Muslim Brotherhood terms.
But it sounds as though, you know, people are not accepting a democratic process. They're sort of saying, unless we win, we're not taking part. I mean, surely you've got to take part, and then if you don't get enough seats this time, try harder next time. I mean, just to say the whole system is rotten, I mean, doesn't help, does it?
I think I'm not trying to be negative, but I don't think Egypt has had the sort of the leisure to have 2, 3, 4, 5 years to develop a democratic system, because the country in its economically is only got about 13 billion on the kitty, which only last about 3 or 4 months of essential imports. So I don't think Egypt will really be in a good position, say, in 6 months' time, even if it got some money from abroad in terms of loans. If it got 3 or 4 billions, it wouldn't go anywhere, even 5 billions. Egypt needs about 50 billions, and that's impossible. IMF are very reluctant to lend to Egypt. So I think the economical situation creating a different environment for the future of Egypt and the stability of the country.
But I mean, changing an economy is even harder almost sometimes than changing politics. And politics is what we're talking about at the moment, I think. I mean, what do you feel about the idea of a boycott by some of these secular parties? Are they correct to do that?
It's very regrettable, because both those in government and those in opposition at the moment need to go through a sharp learning curve, because I would agree Egypt doesn't have the time, ideally, it would need to ensure that the institutions and so forth deliver what they're there for, because of the economic situation. But to to get economic stability, you will need, and to encourage investment, you will need political stability. So this isn't a good sign for outsiders, you know, if parties... So the opposition need, I think, to learn how to be a loyal opposition, how to be critical of the government, but work with sufficient consensus to enable the country to move forward, because they haven't got the luxury for public gestures and politics. That said, I'd have confidence, because in what I find, whether people are Islamists or ultra-secularists or part of the old regime or part of the street reformers, there is a great sense of, first and foremost, being Egyptian. And I think most of the people that I encounter have this very strong sense of national identity. If I may, I'd just pick up on this notion outside of Islamatization. Now, we had a couple of weeks back a very interesting meeting between some secular women's groups from university, from media, from civil society, and two of the Salafist parties. And it was a fascinating discussion, because they had never had the opportunity to come together before and talk about issues. When they started to discuss the issues and fears and concerns of Islamization, the Salafist Party pointed out that many restaurants in central Cairo do not allow women to go in with hijabs. There are many jobs where people are still excluded from because they wear the traditional Islamic dress or whatever. So, you know, there is a learning on both sides, and a need to move forward on both sides. And some of the human rights lawyers that were there at this meeting were quite surprised, because they admitted they hadn't been conscious or aware of that.
Should I? You see, Oliver, I mean, I think a few weeks ago, there's a law passed not to renew alcohol license in many places out in certain districts in Egypt and Cairo. And they said all new licenses will be refused, and the one due for renewal will be not renewed. So that is my worry. Of course, I was listening last night to an Egyptian television and listening to one of the Salafists. He's very eloquent and was very well dressed and speaks very well. But they are spinning the words more than what actually they mean. In Egypt, there is equality, but nonetheless, the problem is they say they refuse. I'm not sure, because my mother used to cover her head. She never declined to go anywhere. But I'm not sure about it, because whoever does that will be breaking the law if they refuse letting a woman wearing the veil, for example, because about 60% of Egyptian women or 70% wearing the veil now.
In the introduction, it was said that Morsi had sacked one of the Salafist al-Noor party people. How can he do that? How can the president just sack somebody from parliament?
Oh, he's not from parliament.
I think it's as an advisor.
As an advisor.
Yeah, as a senior advisor, you know, which I think any government or prime minister or president would be entitled to do.
So that's not a particularly undemocratic move or anything. It doesn't mean anything very dramatic.
I wouldn't see that. I think, you know, I think the Brotherhood are on a massive learning curve. But what I find interesting, I think the Salafist parties are actually faster in learning, because they're not having the responsibility of government. They're much more open. They're much more listening. They're much more wanting to know the issues. And I think the real central issue in Egypt at the moment is, how do you make space for pluralism? Egypt, despite the cultural identity and it being a religious society culturally, it also has a tremendous pluralist tradition, because you've got the Copts there, and you've got you've got secular Egyptians dating right back. Now, I think that's the issue that they have to learn, that there has to be space.
I can tell you one thing, very interesting. I appear in fair numbers of TV stations, and I would say there's dozens of political Islam channels hovering around Egypt and that part, sponsored by certain Arab countries And to be quite honest, they do not give opportunity to anybody else apart from their own ilk. They probably have a bit of window dressing here and there, but I don't know. I feel deeply worried that they have no experience, they have no political program, they have missed the foreign policy, as we could say.
Are you talking about the Brotherhood?
The Brotherhood is the ruling party of Egypt. So they missed the foreign policy. They not clear about situation vis-a-vis Israel, for example. There is so many question marks about their abilities to manage a country of 90 million people.
Yes, but I think that's inevitable. You know, if for four decades, you know, that there hasn't been any sort of political process in the country, and you suddenly have people who have no experience in government thrown into government, and there is a whole institutional sort of block, you might say, to fully cooperating or fully engaging with them, I think you're inevitably going to get these, what I would say, growing pains and deep tensions, and they'll make bad mistakes. But what I'm amazed at is that the protest is relatively small compared, as you said, there are 90 million people. But, you know, you go to Cairo, and unless you go to Tahrir Square, you're totally unaware of the sort of unrest that's going on. Life goes on as normal. In fact, a lot of taxi drivers, a lot of ordinary Egyptians you would meet in the street are opposed to what's going on because for the reasons you said.
Protests, you mean?
The protests, because they feel that it's creating a climate of instability. It's not good for the national image. You get very strong views on the street, and it's not sort of pro-Morsi, but I would say it's pro-Egypt.
Well, it's also a little bit of the media's responsibility, because the media continues to report the Tahrir Square protests all the time, and any little bit of violence is highlighted and so on. I mean, traditionally this time of the year, January, February, March, is the sort of height of the tourist season for Egypt, isn't it?
Yeah.
All the Nile cruises and everything else. Is there any sign that some of that tourism is coming back at all? I mean, you talked about the economy a bit earlier.
No, because it all depends on the confidence. There is something, the periphery, like Sharm el-Sheikh, Aswan, the trips are very cheap, almost 350 pounds, less than the airplane ticket. So, but it's still the core place like Cairo or cities is very poor, and particularly the issue about alcohol, about dress code, the worry. Although the Muslim Brotherhood say they are open-minded now, but they say that in unconvincing manner. So I think there is a lot of problem, as well as no stability. I mean, there's no halfway between this. Each side wants to grab the country, grab the power. Islamists think now Egypt got to be, Islam is the solution. And as I say earlier now, the huge embarrassment about Morsi's, what's said about the Jews, for example, have sort of, it's caused a lot of negative vibes about the future of such people.
But I think within the Islamic movements, there's a very healthy political debate going on. There's a great diversity. I mean, the Brotherhood, within the Brotherhood, there's debate and diversity and thinking of what the way forward. And you look at the younger membership, highly educated, highly in tune with the people who are in the square, you know, people maybe in April the 6th, they're in Abu Futu's party or whatever, but they're still good friends, you know, they socialise together. There isn't that split. Also in the Salafists, I think one of the criticism we get from the political leadership in the Salafists is that Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, are actually funding the religious leaders, and they are making ridiculous statements which then reflects on the political leadership. So there is a big tension, I think, between the political leadership and the diverse religious leadership within Salafism.
Isn't Saudi Arabia also funding the government and Qatar and some of these other Gulf states?
I don't think it's a secret that Saudi Arabia would not want the Brotherhood or Salafist parties, political parties, to succeed in Egypt, because if they do, then it's a model for other Muslim Arab countries. So I think they're vested interests. And sadly to say too, I think there are some Western governments who certainly would not want to see Egypt work. There'd be much more, shall I say, less alarmed if you had the old style regime in place, because that protects
Saudi Arabia
interests.
actually helping Egypt financially? I thought I thought Saudi Arabia was helping the government financially.
Yes, but if
if they wanted, wanted not to succeed, why are they giving it all these loans or grants or whatever?
But who is giving what from Saudi Arabia?
It's very little.
It's promoting. Yes, it's not going to save or create the jobs or the big investment that Egypt needs. What Egypt needs now is economic growth, and that can only come if there's outside investment. And that's what I fear this whole squabble, you might say, in the public arena is preventing, because it would risk putting serious investment into the country. One or two countries, I think the Germans are very good and very supportive, and that's good from Europe. I'm not so sure that some of their neighbours have the same sort of interest.
Is there any fear of sort of expropriation or something like that? I mean, what is the real fear of an investor going in there now? I mean, if there's a small demonstration going in Tahrir Square, that doesn't affect investment,
yes, but
does it?
The image coming out, I mean, you can judge it to be small if you go there, if you go around, if you meet the Egyptians, if you're part of a discussion. But if you're a potential investor and you're looking from afar and all you see on Western media is the demonstrators, you never see the good things that are happening in Egypt now. It's natural you become reluctant to risk a serious investment, because it may be an explosion, there may be a bigger revolution. It's not that the Brotherhood will actually nationalize your investment, but it's if the country disintegrates further, then you have problems.
I think another Tahrir Square will not take more than 300,000 people. Although the people say 2 million and 3 million. Physically speaking, will not take between 250,000 to 300,000. And the educated people, or if I may say the elite, they tend to work. So they only have, say, 2-3 hours to spare to go, say, to Tahrir Square. That's why when you have this huge number of people probably unemployed or not working or etc., that's possible. But usually the secular grouping tend to be a very small number, but I think they're very effective.
And do you think Morsi is secure within his own Muslim Brotherhood? There's no sort of challenge within the party to his leadership, is there? You said that there's a big debate going on about a lot of these policy issues.
I think the debate going on is, internal structures, that Egypt has gone through a major transformation where the top-down approach has been transformed or is in the process of being transformed. Some would say that the Brotherhood still have that model of operating, and some of the sort of younger members would want a more transparent, more open, more democratic, you might say, system within. And I think it's not a damaging debate, it's a healthy debate. It shows that there's real life, that there's a future if you have that sort of debate. It's not going to disintegrate under the pressures of government.
But have you seen the friction between, or recently been reported, between the generals, particularly General Sisi and Morsi? Because there was the rumors going around that he was going to dismiss Sisi and then was scared off somehow. So I think there is some three divisions in Egypt: the seculars, the Islamists, and the military. And
well, we'll have to see how all this plays out in the coming months. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Wafik, Moustafa and Oliver McTernan. And in the second half of the programme, we're going to be talking about Greece. How strong is the right-wing threat?